Have you ever been humiliated at work by someone who had no idea how important you actually were? Because what happened to me that morning started exactly like that. My name is Laura Bennett. And the day my manager gave my seat away in the boardroom, he had no idea he was about to destroy his own career. The boardroom on the 22nd floor was already filling when I walked in. Executives, investors, senior partners. The atmosphere carried that quiet tension that only comes with high-stakes meetings. The long walnut conference table stretched across the room under the bright ceiling lights. Every chair had a printed name card placed neatly in front of it. And near the center of the table, I saw mine, Laura Bennett, right beside the presentation screen. Exactly where the architect of the acquisition model was supposed to sit. The deal on the agenda that morning was worth $80 million. 2 years of financial modeling, risk simulations, market projections, hundreds of late nights in my office after everyone else had gone home. All of it built by me. I placed my laptop on the table and started connecting the display cable to the monitor. The screen flickered to life as my slides loaded. My heart was steady, calm, because today, the board would finally see the work behind the deal. Then the boardroom doors opened. Victor Langley walked in, my manager. Behind him was a tall man in an expensive suit I had never seen before. Victor laughed loudly, greeting the executives like he owned the building. The stranger beside him carried himself like someone used to attention. Victor walked straight toward the table, toward my seat. He stopped beside me, glanced at the name card, then looked over his shoulder. "Daniel," he said casually, "this seat's yours." The stranger stepped forward. Victor finally turned toward me, his expression dismissive. "You can stand in the back, Laura," he said lightly. "Just observe." A few people around the table laughed quietly. For a moment, the room felt very still. I picked up my laptop, slowly stepped away from the table, and moved to the back of the room. Because Victor Langley had absolutely no idea that the $80 million deal he was about to present to the board could not legally close without my signature. I stood near the back wall of the boardroom, my laptop held against my chest like an afterthought. From there, I could see everything. The long table. The investors leaning forward with quiet anticipation. The large screen where my presentation was already projected. And sitting in my seat was Daniel, Victor's friend. Daniel adjusted his cufflinks like he belonged there. Confident, relaxed, completely unaware that the entire deal on the screen had nothing to do with him. Victor clapped his hands once. "All right, everyone," he said loudly. "Let's begin." The room settled. Victor moved to the front of the table, standing beside the screen where my financial model waited. "Today," he announced, "we're presenting the acquisition structure that will bring Helix Biotech under our umbrella." Several board members nodded. $80 million. A deal that would change the company's future. Victor clicked the remote. Slide 1 appeared. My slide. My projections. My risk charts. Victor cleared his throat and began speaking like he had built every number himself. "For the past year," he said confidently, "our team has been modeling the acquisition structure carefully." Our team. I watched quietly from the back. Victor moved through the slides with growing confidence, explaining market penetration forecasts and capital allocation strategies. But something interesting happened. He skipped 2 slides. Important ones. The risk mitigation models. The slides that explained why the numbers worked. Daniel leaned forward, whispering something to him. Victor nodded quickly, pretending nothing was wrong. Across the table, one of the board members raised an eyebrow. Then another director leaned forward. "Victor," he said calmly. "Who built this model?" Victor didn't hesitate. "I did," he replied. From the back of the room. I almost smiled. Because if Victor Langley had actually built that model, he would have known something very important. The deal on that screen was missing the one page that made it legally possible. And only one person in that room had access to it. Me. Victor kept talking. Confident. Smooth. Almost theatrical. From the back of the room, I watched him walk through slide after slide of my work like he had lived inside those spreadsheets for the past 2 years. But something was wrong. The deeper the presentation went, the quieter the room became. Investors started exchanging glances. One of the board members flipped through the printed briefing packet in front of him. Then he stopped. "Victor," he said slowly, "I don't see the compliance certification for this acquisition." The room shifted slightly. Victor's smile tightened. "That will be handled at closing," he replied. The board member didn't look convinced. Another director leaned forward. "That certification is usually submitted before we approve the deal," she said. Daniel glanced at Victor. Victor waved it off. "Just a procedural formality." I crossed my arms. Because it wasn't a formality. That document was the regulatory clearance signature. Without it, the acquisition couldn't legally proceed. Victor clicked to the next slide quickly. A revenue projection chart appeared. He started talking again, louder this time, trying to move the meeting forward. But one of the investors interrupted him. "Excuse me," he said. "I want to understand something." He tapped the printed report. "This model assumes regulatory fast-track approval." Victor nodded. "Correct." "And who secured that clearance?" Victor hesitated for the first time. Then he said something that made several people in the room glance toward the back wall. "Our analyst team handled the paperwork." I stood there quietly. Anonymous. Invisible. The way Victor wanted. But the truth was simple. The regulatory clearance, the legal certification, the authorization required for an $80 million acquisition, all had one name attached to it. Laura Bennett. And Victor Langley had just told the board. I was standing in the back, watching the deal unfold. Victor continued the presentation, but the atmosphere in the room had changed. Subtle, but noticeable. The board members were no longer just listening. Now they were watching him. Carefully. Victor clicked through another slide. "Based on these projections," he said confidently, "we expect the acquisition to generate a 23% return within the first 18 months. Daniel nodded beside him, pretending to review the numbers on the printed report. But one of the investors raised a hand again. "Before we move further," he said calmly, "I'd like clarification on the compliance sign-off." Victor's jaw tightened slightly. "We've already addressed that," he replied. The investor didn't blink. "No," he said. "You haven't." The room fell quiet again. Then the chairman of the board spoke. A slow, measured voice that immediately commanded attention. "Victor," he said. "Who authorized the regulatory certification for this deal?" Victor glanced briefly toward Daniel. Then he straightened. "Our department handled it internally." The chairman leaned back in his chair. "Name." Victor froze for half a second. Then he said the first thing that came to his mind. "Our senior analyst team prepared it." Another pause. The chairman turned toward the head of legal sitting at the far end of the table. "Is that acceptable?" The legal director shook his head slowly. "No." He opened a folder and flipped through several pages. "The certification requires the signature of the registered financial architect responsible for the model." The chairman looked back at Victor. "So again," he said. "Who signed it?" Victor opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Because the truth was standing 20 feet away, quietly watching the entire room. Me, Laura Bennett. And, without my signature, the $80 million deal Victor Langley was presenting to the board was completely useless. Victor's confidence finally cracked. Just a little. But everyone in the room noticed it. He cleared his throat and straightened his tie like he simply needed a second to think. "The certification," he said carefully, "is part of the internal documentation process. It will be finalized before closing." The legal director didn't even look convinced. He flipped another page in the compliance folder. "That's not how this works," he said calmly. "The regulatory approval must already be signed before the board votes." A few investors began whispering to each other. Victor quickly pointed toward Daniel. "Daniel has been reviewing the compliance structure," he said. Daniel blinked. That clearly wasn't part of the plan. He leaned forward awkwardly. "Yes, we've been looking at the approval process." The chairman frowned slightly. "Then perhaps Daniel can explain who signed the regulatory certification." Daniel opened the report in front of him, flipping pages quickly. Searching. His expression slowly changed. Because the page he needed wasn't there. From the back of the room, I watched silently. The certification page had never been included in the printed packets. Not by accident, but because I was the only person authorized to sign it. And I hadn't. Victor stepped forward quickly. "Let's not get stuck on paperwork," he said with forced confidence. "The financials are the real story here." But the chairman didn't move. "The paperwork," he said quietly, "is the entire deal." And suddenly, every eye in the boardroom began looking around the room, searching for the person who had actually built the model, for the person whose signature was missing. And Victor Langley still hadn't realized. That person was standing quietly in the back, watching him. The room had grown completely silent. Not the comfortable silence of a meeting progressing normally. The tense kind. The kind where people start realizing something is wrong. The chairman looked down at the compliance report again. Then he spoke. "Victor," he said slowly, "this acquisition requires certification from the financial architect responsible for the valuation model." Victor nodded quickly. "Of course." "So who is that?" Victor hesitated again. Then he said the words that would later become a serious problem for him. "That would be our analytics department." The legal director immediately shook his head. "No," he said. "That's not what the documentation says." He turned the report so the chairman could see it. The chairman read the line out loud. "Lead Financial Architect, Laura Bennett." My name echoed softly across the boardroom. Victor froze. For the first time since the meeting began, he slowly turned his head and looked toward the back of the room, toward me, standing beside the wall with my laptop in my hands. The chairman followed his gaze. "So Laura Bennett is present?" he asked. Victor forced a smile. "Yes, she's part of the team." The chairman studied me for a moment. Then he asked a simple question. "Ms. Bennett," he said calmly, "did you sign the regulatory certification for this deal?" The entire room turned toward me. Victor's expression tightened, his eyes silently warning me not to say the wrong thing. I stepped forward slowly. Then I answered, "No." The word landed in the center of the room like a dropped glass. Because without that signature, the $80 million acquisition Victor had been presenting for the last 20 minutes did not exist. The reaction was immediate. Several investors sat back in their chairs. One of the directors lowered his pen slowly. The chairman folded his hands on the table. "Then we have a problem," he said. Victor moved quickly. "Let's not overcomplicate this," he said, forcing a laugh. "Laura simply hasn't finalized the paperwork yet." He turned toward me. "Right, Laura." Every person in the room watched me now. Victor's smile looked calm on the surface, but his eyes carried a very different message. "Don't embarrass me. Don't ruin this meeting. Don't say the wrong thing." I walked a few steps closer to the table, not sitting, just standing beside the screen where my slides were still projected. The chairman spoke again. "Ms. Bennett," he said evenly, "why hasn't the certification been signed?" I answered honestly, "Because the compliance review hasn't been completed." A murmur moved through the investors. Victor's voice sharpened. "That review was already cleared." I shook my head. "No," I said calmly. "It wasn't." Daniel looked confused now. Victor looked furious. But the legal director leaned forward. "What part of the compliance review is incomplete?" he asked. I opened my laptop slowly. The screen lit up. Then I turned it toward the boardroom table. "There's an undisclosed financial exposure," I said. Several board members leaned forward. Victor's face went pale, because the slide now displayed on the screen was one that had never appeared in his presentation. A risk analysis chart, highlighted in red. And that chart showed something very important. The $80 million deal Victor had just tried to push through the board had a hidden liability, one that could cost the company another $25 million. The red chart stayed on the screen, bright, impossible to ignore. Several investors leaned forward at the same time. "What is that?" one of them asked. Victor stepped toward the screen quickly. "That's outdated data," he said immediately. But the legal director was already standing. "Let her explain." The room shifted again. The chairman nodded once. "Go ahead, Ms. Bennett." I took a breath, then pointed at the highlighted section of the chart. The acquisition assumes Helix Biotech's intellectual property portfolio is fully secured, I said. That's how the $80 million valuation was calculated. Several heads nodded. Victor folded his arms. Yes, he said sharply. Which is exactly what the deal states. I clicked the next slide. A legal filing appeared. But last week, I continued calmly, a competitor filed a patent challenge on one of Helix's core technologies. Murmurs spread across the room. Daniel sat up straighter. Victor shook his head quickly. That filing won't go anywhere, he said. I looked directly at the board. If the challenge succeeds, I explained, Helix loses exclusive rights to the technology driving 40% of their projected revenue. Silence. Then I finished the sentence. That would reduce the company's value by roughly $25 million. The chairman slowly turned toward Victor. You didn't mention this. Victor's voice tightened. It's speculative. I closed my laptop. It's also the reason, I said quietly, why I refused to sign the certification. And suddenly the boardroom wasn't looking at Victor's presentation anymore. They were looking at him, and wondering why the one person who understood the deal best had been standing in the back of the room. Victor's composure began to unravel. Not dramatically, but in small ways. He loosened his tie, shifted his weight, spoke a little faster than before. This is being exaggerated, he said. Patent challenges happen all the time. The chairman didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned toward the legal director. How serious is the filing? The legal director adjusted his glasses. Serious enough that it should have been disclosed to the board. Victor forced a smile, which we would have done at closing. Several board members exchanged looks. Daniel leaned toward Victor and whispered something. Victor nodded stiffly. Then he turned back toward the table. Look, he said. The core financial model is still solid. The chairman slowly tapped the table. But the architect of that model refused to certify it. Victor's jaw tightened. He gestured toward me. Laura's being overly cautious. The chairman's eyes narrowed slightly. Or, he said calmly, she's doing her job. Silence settled over the room again. Victor glanced at Daniel for support. Daniel cleared his throat. We can always adjust the deal structure, he suggested. The legal director leaned forward. That's not the issue. He pointed toward the screen. The issue is why this risk wasn't presented earlier. Victor opened his mouth. But before he could answer, one of the investors spoke. An older man who had been silent the entire meeting. If this liability is real, he said slowly, then someone tried to rush an $80 million deal past the board without full disclosure. Victor looked at me. And for the first time that morning, his expression wasn't confident. It was worried. Because now the board wasn't asking questions about the deal anymore. They were asking questions about him. The chairman leaned forward. His voice calm. Controlled. Ms. Bennett, he said. How long have you known about this patent challenge? 3 weeks, I replied. Victor turned sharply. That's impossible, he said. I didn't react. The filing appeared in the regulatory database last month, I explained. I submitted a risk report to the department the same day. The chairman looked at Victor. Did you receive that report? Victor hesitated. Just for a second. Then he said, I don't recall seeing it. I opened my laptop again. 2 clicks. Then I rotated the screen toward the table. An email appeared. Timestamped. 3 weeks earlier. Subject line, Helix acquisition, legal risk disclosure. Sent to Victor Langley. The legal director leaned forward to read it. Attachment included, he said quietly. Victor's face lost more color. That doesn't mean. It means, the chairman interrupted, that you were informed. The room had gone completely silent now. One of the investors slowly leaned back in his chair. So let me understand this, he said. Our lead analyst discovered a $25 million liability. He looked at Victor. And you still brought the deal to the board. Victor's voice rose. The deal is still profitable. The chairman didn't raise his voice. But his next words carried far more weight. That's not the point. He turned toward me again. Ms. Bennett, he said. If the liability is confirmed, what would the real acquisition price be? I answered calmly. Approximately $55 million. Several investors exchanged stunned looks. Because that meant something very simple. The deal Victor had been presenting all morning was overpriced by $25 million. And suddenly, the question in everyone's mind wasn't about the deal anymore. It was about why Victor Langley had tried so hard to hide that number. The number hung in the air. $25 million. That was the difference between a smart acquisition and a catastrophic mistake. The boardroom stayed completely silent. Then one of the investors slowly leaned forward. "Victor," he said, "why was this risk hidden from the board?" Victor immediately shook his head. "It wasn't hidden," he said quickly. "It's simply not material yet." The legal director looked unimpressed. "A pending patent challenge affecting 40% of projected revenue is absolutely material." Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Victor ran a hand through his hair. "The challenge hasn't been ruled on yet," he argued. "So it's premature to panic." The chairman didn't move. "But you still tried to close the deal today." Victor hesitated again. "We needed approval to move forward." The older investor at the far end of the table spoke again. "You asked us to approve an $80 million purchase," he said slowly, "for a company that might only be worth 55. Victor's voice sharpened. "That's speculation." I spoke calmly. "No," I said. "It's risk exposure." The room turned toward me again. Victor glared. The chairman raised one hand. "Let her finish." I stepped closer to the table. "The model Victor presented only works if Helix keeps its patent protection," I explained. "If they lose it, their revenue projections collapse." Another silence followed. And this time the board members weren't looking at the slides. They were looking at Victor. Because now the question wasn't just about a bad deal. It was about something worse. Why Victor Langley had tried to push it through anyway. Victor tried to recover control of the meeting. You could see it in the way he straightened his shoulders and forced a confident tone back into his voice. "This discussion is drifting away from the bigger picture," he said. "The acquisition still creates long-term strategic value." The chairman looked unimpressed. "Strategic value doesn't justify ignoring risk disclosures." Victor gestured toward Daniel. "Daniel's been advising us on the expansion strategy." Daniel nodded quickly. "Yes, we believe Helix still represents a strong opportunity." The legal director flipped another page in the report. "Opportunity," he said quietly, "is not the issue." He looked at Victor. "Disclosure is." Victor glanced at me again. The anger in his expression was growing now. He clearly blamed me for the meeting going off script. But the board wasn't watching me. They were watching him. One of the investors spoke again. "If the deal should actually be priced at $55 million," he said, "why were we presented with an $80 million valuation?" Victor answered quickly. "Because that was the seller's expectation." The investor didn't blink. "That's not how negotiations work." Another director leaned forward. "Did anyone attempt to renegotiate the price after this risk was discovered?" Victor didn't answer. Because the truth was simple. No one had renegotiated anything. Victor had simply ignored the risk and tried to close the deal anyway. The chairman slowly turned his attention back toward me. "Ms. Bennett," he said, "you built the financial model." "Yes, based on your analysis." "Should the board approve this deal today?" The room held its breath. Victor stared at me, waiting, praying, because he knew exactly what answer was coming. And it was the one answer that could stop everything. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I looked around the room. At the investors. The directors. The legal team. Then I spoke. "No," I said calmly. The word landed like a hammer. Victor slammed his hand lightly on the table. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "You're sabotaging your own project." I shook my head. "I'm protecting the company." Several board members nodded slightly. Victor's voice rose. "The model still shows strong returns." "Only under perfect conditions," I replied. "And perfect conditions rarely exist." The chairman watched both of us carefully. Then he asked another question. "Ms. Bennett, if this deal were renegotiated to $55 million, would your model support it?" "Yes," I said. Victor turned sharply. "So now you're negotiating pricing in front of the board?" "I'm explaining reality." Daniel shifted nervously. The older investor leaned forward again. "Victor," he said slowly, Did you attempt to renegotiate the acquisition price after receiving Laura's risk report? Victor hesitated. Then he said something that made the entire room go quiet again. The seller wouldn't have agreed. The investor raised an eyebrow. You didn't answer the question. Victor looked trapped. Because if he admitted he never tried, the board would know he pushed an overpriced deal. But if he claimed he tried, someone might ask for proof. And Victor Langley had none. The chairman leaned back in his chair. Then he said something that changed the direction of the entire meeting. I think it's time, he said calmly, that we review how this deal reached the board in the first place. And suddenly, Victor realized something terrifying. The meeting was no longer about approving the acquisition. It was about investigating him. The tone of the room changed immediately. What had started as a deal presentation had quietly turned into an investigation. The chairman folded his hands on the table. Victor, he said calmly, walk us through the timeline. Victor forced a tight smile. The timeline? Yes. How this acquisition moved from internal review to board approval. Victor cleared his throat. The opportunity came through Daniel, he said, gesturing beside him. Daniel nodded quickly. My firm had been advising Helix Biotech on strategic partnerships. The chairman listened carefully. And then, Victor continued. We performed our valuation analysis. Across the room, one of the investors spoke. Meaning Laura performed it. Victor didn't respond. He simply kept talking. After the model showed strong potential returns, we began preparing the acquisition proposal. The legal director leaned forward. And the patent challenge? Victor stiffened. That surfaced later. I spoke quietly. 3 weeks ago. Victor shot me a glare. The chairman looked between us. So the risk appeared before the deal was brought to the board. Yes, I said. Victor answered at the same time. It wasn't material. The chairman didn't react. But several investors exchanged uneasy glances. Because the timeline was becoming clear. Victor had discovered a major risk. And instead of renegotiating, he had tried to close the deal anyway. But the next question from the chairman would make things even worse. Victor, he said slowly. Who set the $80 million purchase price? Victor hesitated. Just long enough for the room to notice. The seller proposed that number, he said finally. Daniel nodded beside him. That was their initial expectation. The chairman tapped his pen lightly against the table. And our company accepted it, without negotiation? Victor shifted in his seat. We believed the valuation supported it. The older investor frowned. Even after discovering the patent challenge? Victor didn't answer right away. Daniel jumped in. The challenge might not affect the final ruling. The legal director leaned back. But it might. Silence spread across the table again. Victor was losing control of the conversation. And everyone in the room could feel it. Then the chairman asked something unexpected. Daniel, he said calmly. Your firm represents Helix Biotech, correct? Daniel nodded. Yes. And you were advising them during this acquisition? Yes. The chairman leaned back in his chair. That means you are sitting at this table, while representing the company we are attempting to purchase. Daniel looked uncomfortable. That's standard advisory work. But the legal director spoke immediately. Not during internal board approval discussions. The room shifted again. Because now another problem had appeared. Daniel's presence in the meeting might have been a conflict of interest. And suddenly the board wasn't just questioning Victor's judgment. They were questioning his ethics. Victor realized what was happening. The meeting was spiraling, and he was losing the room. He stood up suddenly. Let's stay focused, he said sharply. This is still a valuable acquisition. But the chairman didn't move. No, he said quietly. This is now a governance issue. Victor's jaw tightened. Daniel looked pale. The legal director flipped open a policy binder. Company rules prohibit external advisors representing the seller from participating in internal acquisition approvals. Daniel slowly turned toward Victor. You said the board approved my attendance. Victor didn't answer. Because that wasn't true. He had invited Daniel himself. Without disclosing the conflict. One of the investors leaned forward. So let me summarize what we've learned, he said calmly. He raised one finger. The lead analyst discovered a $25 million risk. A second finger. That risk was not disclosed in the presentation. A third finger. The seller's advisor is sitting at our board table. Then he looked directly at Victor. And the deal price was never renegotiated. Victor's face had gone pale. Because the room now understood something very important. This wasn't just a bad deal. It looked like someone had tried to rush an overpriced acquisition through the board, while allowing the seller's advisor to influence the room. The chairman finally spoke again. And his next sentence made the tension snap. "I think we need to pause this meeting," he said. Then he looked at me. "Ms. Bennett." "Yes, please remain." Because the chairman wasn't asking Victor for more explanations anymore. He was asking me. 17. The room slowly emptied. Chairs scraped softly against the floor as several board members stepped out to take calls or speak quietly in the hallway. The investors moved into small clusters, whispering to each other. But the chairman remained seated. So did the legal director. And Victor. Victor looked furious. Daniel stood awkwardly near the door, unsure whether he was supposed to stay or leave. The chairman spoke first. "Daniel," he said calmly, "we'll ask you to step outside for the moment." Daniel nodded quickly and left the room. The door closed. Now it was just 4 people inside the boardroom. The chairman turned toward me. "Ms. Bennett," he said, "I want to understand something." I waited. "You built the acquisition model?" "Yes." "And you discovered the patent challenge 3 weeks ago?" "Yes." "After discovering it, what actions did you take?" I answered simply. "I sent a risk disclosure to Victor." The legal director looked at Victor. "Did you respond to that report?" Victor crossed his arms. "We were still reviewing the situation." The chairman's voice remained calm. "But you scheduled today's board approval meeting." Victor said nothing. The chairman leaned back in his chair. "Ms. Bennett," he said, "from your professional perspective, what should have happened after the patent challenge appeared?" I didn't hesitate. The deal price should have been renegotiated. The legal director nodded slightly. "And if the seller refused? Then we walk away." Victor slammed his hand lightly against the table. "That would have killed the deal." I looked at him calmly. "No," I said. "It would have saved the company $25 million. And for the first time since the meeting began." Victor Langley had no argument left. The chairman sat quietly for a moment. Then he looked at the legal director. "Your thoughts?" The legal director didn't hesitate. "If the risk report was ignored," he said, "that's a serious governance concern." Victor immediately pushed back. "No one ignored anything." The legal director slid the printed email across the table. "This email says otherwise." Victor stared at the paper. But he didn't touch it. The chairman turned toward me again. "Ms. Bennett, when you refused to sign the certification this morning, was that because of this liability?" "Yes." "And if the certification had been signed, the board could have approved the $80 million purchase today?" "Yes." The chairman nodded slowly. Which meant something very clear. Laura Bennett had just prevented the company from potentially overpaying $25 million. Victor leaned forward. "This is being blown out of proportion," he said. "The deal still has value." The chairman's voice stayed calm. "That may be true. But that's not today's problem." Victor frowned. "What do you mean?" The chairman looked directly at him. "Today's problem is whether this board was presented with incomplete information." Victor's expression hardened. "Are you accusing me of misconduct?" The chairman didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to the legal director again. "If the board had approved the deal without knowing about the patent challenge, what would that mean legally?" The legal director closed the folder slowly. "It could be considered a failure of fiduciary disclosure." The room fell silent. Because that phrase meant something very serious. It meant someone might be responsible for misleading the board. Victor stood up. His chair slid back across the floor. "This is ridiculous," he said sharply. "You're acting like I committed a crime." The chairman didn't raise his voice. "Sit down, Victor." Victor didn't move for a moment. Then he slowly sat again. The chairman folded his hands together. "Let's clarify something." He looked at Victor. "Did you read Laura Bennett's risk report 3 weeks ago?" Victor hesitated. Everyone in the room noticed. "Yes," he said finally. "And after reading it, did you inform the board?" Victor didn't answer. Because there was only one truthful answer. No. The legal director spoke quietly. Did you inform the acquisition committee? Victor remained silent. Another pause. Then the chairman asked the question that finally broke the tension in the room. Victor, he said calmly, did you attempt to close an $80 million deal without disclosing a $25 million risk to the board? Victor's face flushed. That's not what happened. But his voice didn't sound confident anymore. The chairman leaned back in his chair. Then he said something that made Victor's expression change completely. We'll need to open a formal review. Victor froze. A review? Yes. The chairman looked toward me. Ms. Bennett. Yes. Please send your full risk report to the board and legal department. Because the moment those documents reached the board, Victor Langley's attempt to rush the deal through approval would become official record. And once that happened, his career inside the company might not survive it. The chairman stood. The signal was clear. The meeting was over. But this wasn't the kind of ending Victor Langley had expected when he walked into the boardroom that morning. Investors began gathering their documents. Directors whispered quietly among themselves. The legal director closed his folder and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he turned to me. Please send the full report to my office within the hour, he said. I will, I replied. Victor remained seated, staring at the table. The confidence he had carried into the room earlier was gone. When the last investor left, the chairman paused beside Victor's chair. You should speak with legal before you leave the building, he said calmly. Victor looked up sharply. This is completely unnecessary. The chairman didn't argue. He simply said one more thing. Attempting to close an $80 million acquisition without full disclosure is not a small oversight. Then he walked out. The door closed. Victor and I were the only two people left in the boardroom. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Victor slowly stood. You enjoyed that, he said coldly. No, I replied calmly. I prevented a bad decision. Victor's eyes narrowed. You just destroyed your own department's biggest project. I picked up my laptop. No, I said. You did that. And as I walked toward the door, Victor finally realized something. The quiet analyst he had pushed to the back of the room had just become the most important person in the entire meeting. Within an hour, my report was in the board's inbox. Every document, every risk analysis, every projection. The email thread began growing quickly. Legal requested additional clarification. 2 investors asked follow-up questions. The chairman asked for a complete review of the acquisition timeline. Meanwhile, Victor's office door remained closed all afternoon. Daniel never returned to the building. By late afternoon, a company-wide calendar notice appeared. Emergency governance meeting, executive leadership only. Victor was included. So was the legal department. And surprisingly, so was I. When I walked into the smaller conference room that evening, the atmosphere felt very different from the morning meeting. Quiet. Serious. The chairman sat at the head of the table. The legal director sat beside him. Victor arrived last. His expression was tight. The chairman began immediately. We've reviewed Laura Bennett's documentation. He looked at Victor. The patent challenge was clearly identified 3 weeks ago. Victor didn't speak. The chairman continued. And the board was never informed. Victor finally responded. We were still assessing the situation. The legal director shook his head. The report recommended renegotiating the deal immediately. Victor's silence confirmed everything. The chairman leaned forward. There's another issue. Victor looked up. What issue? The chairman opened a folder. The presence of Daniel Harper at the board approval meeting. Victor's face hardened. He's an industry advisor. The legal director spoke quietly. He's also Helix Biotech's strategic consultant. And suddenly the situation had become even worse. Because now Victor wasn't just accused of hiding risk. He had allowed the seller's advisor to sit inside the boardroom. During an acquisition vote, Victor looked around the room, searching for support. But there was none. The chairman spoke again. Daniel Harper represents the company we intended to purchase. Victor said nothing. Allowing him to participate in our internal approval meeting is a serious conflict of interest. Victor leaned forward. I invited him for strategic insight. The legal director's voice remained calm, without disclosing that relationship to the board. Silence. Victor rubbed his forehead. This is being exaggerated. The chairman shook his head slowly. No, it's being documented. He slid another paper across the table. A printed copy of my original email. The risk disclosure. Timestamped 3 weeks earlier. Victor, he said quietly. You received this. Yes. You understood the liability. Victor didn't respond. And yet you scheduled the acquisition vote anyway. Victor's shoulders dropped slightly. Because now the entire timeline was undeniable. The chairman looked toward me. Ms. Bennett. Yes. If the board had approved the deal this morning, would the company have been exposed to the full liability? Yes. And the liability could reach $25 million? Yes. The chairman nodded slowly. Then he turned back toward Victor and delivered the sentence that ended the conversation. Victor Langley, he said calmly. We are opening a formal ethics investigation into your conduct. Victor stared at him, speechless. Because just a few hours earlier, he had walked into the boardroom planning to present the biggest deal of his career. And now, he was the subject of an investigation that could end it. The room stayed silent after the chairman's words. Victor Langley sat frozen in his chair. An ethics investigation. Inside a public company, that phrase carried weight. Careers had ended over less. Victor finally spoke. This is unbelievable. The chairman didn't react. You allowed a seller's advisor to sit inside a board approval meeting, he said calmly. You failed to disclose a material risk. And you attempted to close an $80 million deal without regulatory certification. Victor looked at me. His eyes filled with frustration. This is because of you. I didn't respond. The legal director spoke instead. This is because of documentation. He lifted the report. Documentation that Ms. Bennett provided. Victor leaned back slowly. Fine, he said bitterly. You stopped the deal. But the chairman shook his head. No. Victor frowned. What do you mean? The chairman looked toward me. Laura didn't stop the deal. He tapped the table. She stopped the price. The room went quiet again. Victor looked confused. The chairman continued. We contacted Helix Biotech this afternoon. Victor's expression changed. And once their board realized the patent challenge was known to us, they agreed to renegotiate. The legal director slid a document across the table. A revised acquisition offer. Victor stared at it. The number printed on the page made his face go pale. $55 million. Exactly the number my model had predicted. Because while Victor had tried to push an overpriced deal, the board had just used my analysis to negotiate the company down by $25 million. The chairman leaned back in his chair. The acquisition may still happen, he said calmly. But it will happen under the correct valuation. Victor didn't speak. He simply stared at the paper. $25 million saved. Because one analyst refused to sign a certification. The legal director spoke next. The board has also reviewed Ms. Bennett's work on the financial model. He looked at me. Your analysis was accurate. Thank you. The chairman nodded slowly. And your decision not to sign the certification prevented the board from approving an overpriced acquisition. Victor finally looked up. His voice sounded tired now. So Laura's the hero now? The chairman didn't smile. She protected the company. Victor laughed bitterly. And what about me? The chairman answered calmly. The ethics review will determine that. Silence filled the room again. Then the chairman turned toward me. Laura, he said. Yes. Who built the original acquisition model? I did. And who identified the risk? I did. And who stopped the approval until the numbers were correct? I did. He nodded once. Then he said something Victor never expected to hear. Beginning next quarter, the board would like you to oversee all acquisition modeling for the company. Victor's eyes widened. Because that role had always belonged to him. But not anymore. 2 months later, the Helix acquisition closed. At $55 million. Exactly where the numbers said it should have been. The board publicly praised the financial analysis that helped renegotiate the deal. But inside the company, everyone knew the real story. One analyst had refused to sign a certification, and that decision saved the company $25 million. Victor Langley never returned to the 22nd floor boardroom. The ethics investigation concluded quietly. Officially, he resigned. Unofficially, everyone understood why. Daniel Harper disappeared from the process entirely once the conflict of interest became public record. And the seat at the boardroom table Victor had taken away from me that morning was given back. Permanently. Now, whenever the board meets to review acquisitions, my name card sits beside the presentation screen. Laura Bennett. The same seat Victor once told me to give away. Sometimes I still think about that moment. Victor standing beside my chair, telling me to move, telling me to stand in the back of the room. He thought he was humiliating me. But what he didn't understand was something very simple. The most important person in a deal isn't the loudest voice in the room. It's the one person whose signature actually matters. And that morning, when my manager gave my seat to his friend, he forgot something critical. The $80 million deal he wanted the board to approve could never close without Laura Bennett.